And that gun shot us all the way to Oil Ocean Zone, once again from Sonic 2. To tell the truth, if you're going to bring back a certain number of zones from each game, I'll talk more about that in a bit once we actually see a clear pattern of the zones. I'll be honest, Oil Ocean makes sense because we're getting close to the end of the game, so you want to ramp up, so Oil Ocean makes sense from that regard. But I am not a fan of this zone just because I always remember getting stuck at this zone when I used to play Sonic 2. If I could get this far, I'd always game over here, to be honest. I never even made it to like Metropolis as a kid, to be honest. I can't imagine how poorly that would have gone. Given that as an adult, Metropolis definitely gave me a lot of trouble the first few times I tried playing through Sonic 2 and tried to actually finish the game. True story, actually. One of the first times I ever attempted to finish Sonic 2, which I think was part of the Genesis collection on Steam, if I'm not mistaken, because I could have sworn I ended up rewinding a few times. But either way, the first time I actually really sat down and tried to play through all of Sonic 2 at all, not even, discounting save states or anything like that, was actually the day before Sonic Mania dropped. And the reason is because it wasn't a midnight release. So basically, I was all primed for it to download and for me to play it at like midnight, and then it was actually like, 8 AM the next morning, so I ended up just playing Sonic 2 instead. Again, despite being one of my favorite Sonic games, it took me many years to actually sit down and try to finish Sonic 2. But again, it is one of my favorites. In some ways I almost feel like it's because I didn't play it as much as Sonic 3, so it still manages to be a little bit more fresh. But again, I think it's a very charming game. It just falls apart in the back portion of it. Basically, Oil Ocean onwards, the level design you can definitely tell wasn't as polished, and again, they did have to cut out a lot of content, which definitely feels obvious with how oddly structured some of the latter half is. As a new zone in Mania, I feel like Oil Ocean is fine, but again, it just wouldn't have been my first choice. I almost would have gone with like the Mystic Cave Zone. I actually don't remember if that's the right name or not, but either way, the Cave Zone, just because I almost feel like it would lead in nicely to something else that we'll be seeing in a bit. We didn't even see the boss attack. Since that boss didn't get to do anything, it's worth mentioning that its gimmick is it'll cause the pumps to fly up into the spikes. So obviously that'll deal damage or crush you. I actually don't remember which it is, but either way, obviously we fought it so quickly that it didn't even get a chance to activate its attack. Act 2 has some choices. Again, I'm not a big fan of Oil Ocean, so taking mechanics from Sandopolis and putting them into Oil Ocean, aka taking one of my least favorite zones from Sonic 2 and combining it with mechanics from my least favorite zone of Sonic 3, definitely isn't my favorite thing in the world. Instead of ghosts appearing, basically if it gets too smoggy and smoky, it'll basically start you'll start losing rings slowly. If you're using Supersonic, obviously it doesn't matter as much because your rings are draining anyway, but obviously you'll want to keep the sky as clear as possible to hang onto your rings. This next boss is also like awful, so I would really like to have Supersonic for it because it'll make things so much simpler. It's very interesting. This next boss definitely gave people trouble. Again, kind of like with Special Stage 5. I remember a lot of people having trouble with the Act 2 boss of Oil Ocean. So again, I can't say I'm exactly looking forward to that. But yeah, basically, the little launchers like that, that's what the boss's gimmick was last time, but again, we didn't even see an attack at all. Which again, is kind of nice, because that boss can be a little bit annoying at times. And we'll say, even as someone who's not a Sandopolis or Oil Ocean fan, I will admit that I think this level is better than the originals of both. In general, the level design in Sonic Mania is fun. And even some of the less desirable themings end up having pretty solid like level concepts. We can also set the oil on fire with the fire shield, so that's just a fun little gimmick there. So again, another little environmental interaction using one of the element shields. I will be honest, I'm not entirely sure where I'm going right now. I'm getting a little bit turned around. The smoke is definitely not helping there, but luckily I think we should be back on track. But we also have a submarine over here. Obviously, if you can actually head inside, you won't have to worry about the smoke as much, which is nice. It is a nice little addition to the stage, having these little, like, submarine-based sections. Definitely something that wasn't in the original. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't even be able to have like a mid-stage transition like that on Genesis very easily, or at least load this seamlessly at the very least. But again, I do feel like that is a nice little detail to kind of spice things up a little bit. But again, even as a critic of the original stages, I do have fun with this stage for what it's worth. Again, not my favorite zone from Mania regardless, but again, way better than the original counterparts. I'm actually trying to think of what my favorite stage in Mania would be next to Press Garden, because obviously that is my favorite overall, specifically the Act 2 aesthetic. And I honestly don't really know. Again, a lot of the stages are pretty solid past that point, to the point where I actually have a hard time picking like a second favorite. Maybe Studiopolis? You might notice a pattern here. In general, the original stages stand out more, partly because the original, so like the color palettes can be a lot more flashy. The overall like music can definitely go a lot more wild and more experimental rather than kind of adhering a little bit towards the original like composition styles. So again, in general, I do feel like the original stages stand out a lot more. So this is kind of like a callback to the Oil Ocean fight from Sonic 2 actually, where you have the little like spike things launching out, and you also should have a turret again. And I remember losing like at least 5 to 10 lives on this fight the first time I played it. Mostly because I kept getting crushed by random things, like when the platform would come down and get crushed by it somehow. So yeah, I'm just going to say nope, and use Supersonic to get through that way faster. I might be mistaken, but I think that might also be one of the Plus exclusive zone transitions. To me, it's a little bit silly when you actually think about it, because Sonic 2 takes place on, I think, South Island, and Sonic 3 obviously takes place in Angel Island, so we have a little bit of an inconsistency of like, man, that sub actually made it all the way over here somehow, in a very timely manner. So yeah, some of the act transitions can feel a little bit flimsy. To tell the truth, because I was talking so much about, like, the Sonic 2 development history, I actually can't remember if I mentioned my grievance with the Hydro City to Mirage Saloon stage transition. So just in case I forgot to mention that, because I genuinely can't remember, but again, with the Hydro City one, if I recall correctly, with Marble Garden Zone in Sonic 3, you basically have like a water geyser launch all the way to the surface. And I definitely wish they had done something like that for Hydro City and Mania, partly because, in this case, in Sonic and Knuckles, or Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Angel Island, the Angel Island zone leads directly into Hydro City, meaning if you actually use the geyser in the stage for Mania, you could actually explain that as how they get back to the surface, and that's where the tornado would have actually landed, around that spot. So again, I almost feel like it's a missed opportunity not to, one, call back to Marble Gardens transition, and also to not actually better explain how we go from underground to suddenly we have the tornado again, and we're suddenly at South Island again in a desert. So again, I guess I'm kind of making an assumption that the desert zone is close to Sonic 2's location just by the nature of it being a callback and also leading directly into Oil Ocean. But again, I do feel like some of the act or zone transitions do end up feeling a little bit flimsy, but again, a lot of them just had like a fade out originally, so this is obviously preferable to that, obviously. But again, sometimes I do wish they had gone a little bit farther with some of them, though in some cases, I definitely feel like it would have been a lot more work, obviously, you know, showing them landing on the surface of Angel Island Zone and going back to the landing spot to actually get the tornado. That would obviously be a lot more work, and you can make the assumption that that's what happens, but either way. I really haven't spent much time talking about Lava Reef. This is like my favorite song in terms of the remix songs. And the funny part is, it's kind of just the Lava Reef song from Sonic 3 Knuckles, but one thing I really love about T. Lopes' work in Mania, and again, I am hoping that's the case also for Superstars too, but the problem with Sonic 4's music is it basically tries to use instrumentation that sounds like it would belong on a Genesis. Meanwhile, with T. Lopes, I feel like he didn't do that with Mania. Like, these definitely aren't, like, this isn't Genesis synth, and that's not a complaint in my opinion, because oftentimes trying to replicate that ends up sounding really bad. This sounds like the core tune, but kind of modernized, but still doesn't feel out of place with this aesthetic. So again, it's a weird balance where it's definitely not like chiptune like you hear in Sonic 4, but it definitely feels, you know, less robust than something you might hear in, like, a game that didn't try to go for a retro aesthetic, if that makes sense. So again, it's a very perplexing style that somehow works really well, and to tell the truth, I can't really explain it any better, unfortunately. But either way, again, this is a fantastic remix in my opinion, and yeah, it really captures the essence of the zone without just kind of resorting to sounding like the sound font is directly being pulled from a Genesis. And again, that's part of the main complaint with Sonic 4, is just how, I don't know what the word I'd use to describe it is, maybe like, it's trying to go for the sound, but it doesn't have like the composition work to back it up, basically, because I almost feel like that's my issue with Sonic 4, is just how, like, not memorable and at worst grating a lot of the music is. So even though it's trying to be authentic, also because that is going for like a 3D aesthetic, I almost feel like the chiptune vibes don't actually fit when you're actually going for like a 3D visual style with the modern Sonic character design, for example. So yeah, I think that's part of the reason why Sonic 4's music doesn't quite gel with the overall art style, for example, and the overall style of the game, is it is a merger of classic and modern Sonic in a lot of ways, in a way that kind of makes the music feel like too retro for what else the game is trying to accomplish. Meanwhile, this feels like a perfect blend, where obviously, you know, graphically this is way more advanced than something you'd see on a Genesis, maybe a Saturn at best, in terms of like, you know, or at worst, I don't know which would be correct in this context, but either way, so the music having that kind of like Genesis vibe without just using Genesis sounds, I think is a great idea. We have to basically lure this driller robot into drilling into the ground and getting hit by the lava, if you're wondering how this works. This is another great example of what I was talking about, where obviously you would not hear music of this quality on the Genesis, but it still just captures the atmosphere of the stage really well, with more modern instrumentation. At some point I'll actually talk more about Lava Reef, because I've mostly just been talking about like the music at this point of the overall game, but in general I do really like having Lava Reef here, to kind of tie back to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and to kind of set up some things later on. In general, again, I think the stage looks fantastic. Like, the aesthetics are great, the visuals are phenomenal. The one thing I don't like are these little spinny platforms, so I'm pretty sure that's also a gripe I have with Sonic 3 and Knuckles, to be fair, where sometimes it can be a little bit unwieldy trying to actually launch yourself up there. There's actually invincibility there. I'm trying to jump off of the loop with proper timing to actually reach that. It took a few tries. Yeah, in general, this is a fun stage. There's one part that always stresses me out. This also applies to the original, to be fair, but for some reason I almost never die to, like, the crushing blocks in this stage, but I always feel like I'm about to. Like, that drop there feels horrifying, even though I'm pretty sure I've actually never died to that. It just feels like you're a frame away from being crushed, especially when you're playing a game on the Retro Engine, which again, tends to be a little bit more unforgiving with crushing hitboxes. So because of that, I always kind of worry a little bit whenever I have to go in between like two crushers like that. But again, usually here at least, it doesn't really present too much of a problem. Again, it's more of a problem, oddly enough, in Chemical Plant well stages. We have a very well-timed lava shield there. This is the part I was thinking of, where it just feels like you'll barely avoid these every time, and like, I don't know how you survive that in this engine especially, but it works somehow, so I can't complain. We also have these little conveyor belts that I think are actually drawn from a Sonic CD stage, the name of which I'm not remembering. I am actually... Quartz Quadrant, that's the one. I wanted to say Wacky Workbench, but that's something else. Yeah, Quartz Quadrant has a lot of, like, level gimmicks in common with this, but again, it is cool seeing, like, mechanics from, like, CD stages being put into a stage like this in a way that actually feels completely organic. I think that's the other thing that feels really impressive about a lot of the level design, is taking mechanics that weren't necessarily in the original and incorporating them very seamlessly into a game like this. Again, I just think this game is really fantastic. Again, there's very few levels that I actually dislike, and even at worst, the stages that there are a couple stages I'm kind of indifferent to, but again, very few I straight up dislike, which is a very good feeling. Again, given I'm not the biggest fan of, like, a lot of Sonic 2's endgame, and Sandopolis, and a few others. Again, I've talked about this before, but again, Sonic 3 I actually think is the better half compared to Sonic and Knuckles, just based on the overall level design. There are some good levels out of Sonic and Knuckles, but in general, I do prefer the first half. I think it starts strong and kind of trails off at the end. And in some ways, I almost feel like that's really impressive about Mania, is you really never feel that, like, fatigue point with this game, where it just stays pretty consistent throughout, and it's really impressive. We also have a very interesting boss fight. I'm not going to use Supersonic because I actually want to highlight the boss and I don't want to get through it too quickly. This boss is very unique. If I'm not mistaken, this is the Heavy Rider, basically another hard-boiled heavy with a ball and chain and riding a Motobug. This Motobug actually has a name. This Motobug is named Jimmy, after a member of the Sonic ROM hacking community, Polygon Jim, who actually worked on a ROM hack that made a Motobug a playable character in Sonic 1. But unfortunately he passed away in 2013 in a car accident, so this is basically a tribute to him. Honestly, I think this is a really nice detail, and again, shows how much love was poured into Sonic Mania, not only for Sonic, but also the wider ROM hacking community. I actually think this is really clever, because in the original Sonic 3, obviously, Lava Reef / Hidden Palace leads into Sky Sanctuary, and then by extension, the Death Egg Zone. Meanwhile, we go to Metallic Madness, meaning it essentially leads into Sonic CD's Little Planet in terms of the overall, like, pacing. So in that way, I actually think this is a clever subversion of what you might expect. So we don't actually have a Death Egg, we have essentially a Little Planet instead, if I'm not mistaken. We still don't have an answer of what happened to the little planet after Sonic 4, unfortunately. I don't know if we ever will. I don't even think like the comics have ever addressed that, and I'm actually kind of surprised, given how much that the comics tend to kind of focus on different aspects of the series. I'm amazed no one's ever actually tried to address like whatever happened after Sonic 4. And now it's so far back, I don't know if anyone would, but who knows, maybe someday. But either way, I have a lot of memories of the stage from Sonic CD, and I think I talked about it a bit when we went through CD. They're not all good memories. This is actually one of the first times I ever experienced a time over in a Sonic game, because this took me like 10 minutes to get past the one part in the original stage that ended up looping. So I got really turned around, and yeah, I struggled a lot. But again, Sonic CD was one of the only other classic Sonic games other than Sonic 3, and then a locked-on Sonic & Knuckles to actually have a save feature, meaning Sonic CD I think was like the second 2D Sonic game I ever finished. So I do have nostalgia for CD, and again, I definitely did warm up to it after playing through the Origins version, as many problems as that version has. But again, I have kind of come around to thinking Sonic CD is a pretty solid game overall. Again, not my favorite 2D Sonic game, but a pretty good one. But again, I also see why it has its very staunch defenders and haters both, because it is very different stylistically in terms of the overall like game design standpoint. Like, what it's trying to do is so different than the main trilogy that it both stands out in positive ways and negative ways in some ways, which again, here's hoping Superstars ends up being good. Again, by the time this video comes out, we'll know, but with Naoto Oshima and Arzest working on Superstars, I kind of suspect it might have more in common with CD compared to like Sonic 1 through 3, or at least 2 and 3 specifically, so I am curious to see how that pans out. But again, this is all just kind of speculation at this point, because again, this is being recorded about like a month before Superstar's actual release. But I am looking forward to it. I really hope it turns out well. It seems promising at this point, and yeah, by the time this video comes out, we'll know. I also love this foreground and background sequence. I'm pretty sure that was also in CD, to be fair. But again, I just feel like it's a very cool detail, and we should have a very interesting boss here. This is a callback to the final boss of Sonic 1. We have the Crushers, so I'm pretty sure there are more Crushers. I think there were only 4, but obviously this being a widescreen game, there has to be an extra one. We also have the little like electric ball launcher on the side over there, like in the original. Obviously at Supersonic, this is kind of trivial. In the original, obviously you wouldn't even be able to have Supersonic, given that there were only 6 Chaos Emeralds in the original. But yeah, that definitely speeds up this fight considerably, which I can't complain. It's still very tedious. It's not one of my favorite final bosses in the series, just for its simplicity. However, there is a catch. There is a pinch phase, where a certain amount of Crushers will go off, and I think the 4th one will have Eggman in it. So we basically have to figure out the pattern and stay on our toes to avoid getting crushed in the meantime. That was very close. I'm pretty sure they can't go like twice in a row also, so you can't get like pinned down at least. Truth be told, I actually can't really name which song is which from Metallic Madness. Again, Stardust Speedway was very recognizable which time state we were in. Meanwhile, this doesn't really change a whole lot, but we definitely have different music. And again, I do know both of these are variations. My guess would obviously be like Good Future, or a future version for the music of this one. But we also have Tiny Sonic too, which is very cool. Again, I'm pretty sure this was a mechanic in CD as well, but obviously the sprite has been updated a little bit to be a little bit more modern, and again, I just really love the sprite work in the game and how much it pops compared to the original games. Again, they keep the same, like, overall vibe of the character design, but just feel a lot more vibrant in a way that just really stands out, and again, I think this game just looks phenomenal from beginning to end. You also have a Tiny Sonic Super Form. That was probably a mistake, to be honest, because now we actually have to keep our rings for a very long time. Hypothetically, we could jump into a pinball minigame just to basically reset our Super Form and to hold on to our rings. But yeah, basically I wanted to make sure we could actually get through that with as many rings as possible. And as is, we might actually be able to make it to the next boss with this Super Form intact. At least that's my hope. This fight's not a problem, mind you. I definitely feel like the Crusher one is actually worse. Also, these fall way faster than CD. They basically show where they will drop, and then just slam them down, so be aware of that. No slow dropping here. So yeah, that's a little bit stressful, as someone who didn't remember that was the case, as someone who's also played CD more recently than Mania. So yeah, that was a little bit scary, but luckily I remembered in time. We also have the little foreground and background elements with these little like spinny platforms like in CD. So again, in general, I almost feel like this stage doesn't draw as much from multiple stages like a lot of the other stages we've seen so far. This feels a lot more like closely adhering to the original Metallic Madness by comparison, but it's still a pretty fun stage. We actually have to fight this boss as the Tiny Sonic. We have a gotcha machine here that drops various robots. There's an Amy one, there's one based off the drill robot from Sonic 2. There should be one based off of the Marble Zone boss, and I want to say there's another one too that we haven't seen, but it might just be those three. So yeah, overall this is a fun boss fight, a very referential boss fight, but yeah, very charming nonetheless, and again, a lot easier with all the Chaos Emeralds. Now we have to dodge the sparks and basically drop Eggman out of the Gotcha Capsule to finish off the fight and Metallic Madness as a whole. First, we have to return to our original size.